Happy Tuesday, everybody. It is May 14th, 2024. We're doing a GC Live a little bit later today, after 2:30, so appreciate everyone that was already tuned in, but we'll tune in later today as well. Off-season mode continues to roll on for South Carolina. Shane Beamer will continue his welcome home tour. He's hit a couple spots. We've heard from him a little bit this off-season. We'll play some of the sound from this past week because last time we spoke, Joe, that Monday prior, that's when Shane Beamer shared one of the least kept secrets. I mean, everyone knew that at least coming out of the spring, that Lenora Sellers will be the starting quarterback for South Carolina. Basically what that means, to give you the summary in case you missed it. Point being is heading into camp, it's Lenora's job to lose. And I think we already knew that coming out of spring, but first time the head ball coach has said that publicly. So, having said that, what has took place since the last time we spoke? Well, we had Drew Taramari. I can't even friggin' say his name at this point. Tuazama. It doesn't matter now because he's gone. Drew hopped into the portal, so he's gone. And when you look at that edge room, right, whether Drew was in the room, whether Drew was gone like he is now, we already knew South Carolina has a lot of talent in that edge room, right? A lot of talent. And it's not even the fact that you brought in a guy like Dylan Stewart, five-star guy who we saw do some good things in that spring game, and certainly will be one of those true freshmen to keep an eye on right off the bat. But the experienced players that they brought in via the transfer portal, some of the players that have been here, whether it be a Brian Thomas Jr., whether it be someone like Desmond Umeozulu, right? You have so much talent in that room. So while we've discussed it before, while we've heard Sterling Lucas share about it in meetings, press conferences, that this will be a room that ultimately they hope to be able to have hockey shifts. And essentially what that means is being able to sub guys in and out. Well, even if that does happen in a perfect world, guess what? Not everyone's going to be able to go out there and see the same number of snaps. I mean, you don't have to be Bear Bryant to know that. So when you look at that room, who was going to be the odd man out? Drew is probably going to be in that conversation. And that's not to say he's not good. It's just that room is very loaded, especially when you look at it from a paper standpoint, Joe.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, for the first time in a long time, this defensive end room looks the part, is loaded with talent, right? So I think, it's super beneficial, right? When you have that much talent. Now, this is kind of the downside of it, right? You're going to lose some guys. Drew Tuazama, like you said, Mike, was probably the odd man out in that room. You're looking at Kyle Kennard, JT Gear, Dylan Stewart also making waves. Like, I mean, the kid has shown up and surpassed expectations, which is crazy for a kid like that had so much hype coming in. But, Drew Tuazama, I mean, it sucks to see him go. But, again, it's, this kind of round of transfers is just kind of cleaning off the top of, the roster and the rooms and stuff like that. So, it'll be interesting to see where Drew ends up. But again, Mike, the defensive end room has so much talent in it, especially you get Gilbert Edmond back too.
Yeah.
So then you factor that in with Brian Thomas, JT Gear, and then Des Yu and Dylan Stewart are the two young guns bringing it up. Like, that's a complete SEC defensive end room. Like, right? You have the vets, you have the guys that are on their way up, and then you got the young guns that are both projected to be really good. So, like I said, I think for the first time in a long time, this defensive end room is deep, and it also looks the part, can play the part, right? So I have big expectations for this defensive end room, and as we all should, right? Because Sterling Lucas and all the other coaching staff is really, really, really excited about what they have in that room. So I think it's going to be the difference maker for this defense. And obviously, I mean, we'll talk linebackers, I'm sure, Mike, but defensive end leads the way, and then you need your linebackers to step up from there. But I think this defensive end room, and also, I mean, the defensive tackles as well, you've fully restocked there too. That whole defensive line as a whole, I think is going to be the difference maker, or at least the difference between this year and last season, right? Because I don't think you had any help on the defensive line, and that attributed to some of the defense that we saw. And I think towards the end of last season, when people were saying fire Clayton White, now I think it's going to be the opposite, right? I think this defense is fully restocked. you can finally have a fair judgment on this defense because there's talent across the board.
And when you look at that room, and you can see on your screen that is a breakdown. You get to see some other positions in there as well, but a breakdown of the current players on South Carolina's roster, specifically talking about that defensive end room. We talk about the edges, the guys that are on scholarship. And when you look at it, I mean, there's just talent. There's just friggin' talent there. Now, to give you an idea, in case you're new to this, these are true freshmen or redshirt freshmen. Umeozulu did not redshirt. So that's got 2 true freshmen, redshirt right here. And then we keep moving on up, sophomore, junior, senior. So, and some of those guys, of course, having a 5th year in there as well. But looking at that edge room, and I talked about this heading into the spring, and if you've been following along since the spring wrapped up for South Carolina, we're doing post-spring assessments on each room. We will get to the edge room at some point. We've had breakdowns on the safety room. We've had breakdowns on the quarterback room and the running back rooms so far. So if you want to go check that out, head on over to Gamecock Central. Sign up today, just $1 for your first month. A perfect time to do so because, well, recruiting season is going to start to pick up. As we've seen in the past during the Shane Beamer era, once we get towards the end of May and we head into June, that's when things really start to crank up for the Gamecocks. And they've already had a couple players that they've been able to pick up. We'll talk about some other things from a recruiting standpoint on this program today. But if you really want a deeper look at it, not just football, but basketball, that's been picking up, especially with the transfer portal. Head on over to Gamecock Central. We have baseball in there as well. Plenty going on right now in the world of Gamecock athletics, which it feels like is always the case, but especially now in this new era when we talk about the transfer portal being just the big game changer for not just football, but for basketball as well, baseball too. So certainly head on over and check out what's going on GC. Having said that, though, I mentioned Brian Thomas, and these are some of the notes that I wrote about Thomas in the spring, heading into spring practices. He had a strong spring game performance last year, started in 6 of the 12 games this past season that he appeared in, picked up 22 tackles, was also credited with 2 tackles for a loss, 1 sack, 1 forced fumble, has 2 years of eligibility remaining. Well, what did he do this spring? He dominated the spring game again. And from talking with coaches, I mean, I spoke with Sterling Lucas leading up to the spring game, day or two before, and he's like, keep an eye on him. He's going to be special. He's going to be special. And you can see why. You can see why someone like Brian Thomas has the ability to be. And it's not just the fact that I mentioned Brian Thomas. It's not the fact that, like his dad, Brian Thomas, Sr., that he comes from a football family. He understands what it's all about in terms of being a pro, even at the college level, and acting like a pro and treating your craft as such. But what he's able to bring you on the field, he's not just a one-trick pony. He's not someone that's going to try to beat you with just power. His skill set is totally different than some of these other players, and that's okay. But that's what makes him special. And I think that's the beauty too, Joe, when we look at this edge room. Talk about Kyle Kennard, keep going down the list, right? Desmond Umeozulu, Gear in there as well. Elijah Davis transferring on in a year ago from East Mississippi Community College, had an opportunity to play a couple games. And I think he's going to see some more time this year as well. And obviously don't want to forget Dylan Stewart. But I think the big thing is when you look at that room, what it reminds me of, if you want to make a comparison, it reminds me of like a bullpen in baseball.
Oh yeah.
You know, like you have so many different skill sets in that room. It's not just going to be fastball. It's not just going to be a curveball, right? They have so many weapons at their disposal. And I think that's the challenging part. So when we talk about the ability in a perfect world to be able to treat that edge room like a hockey team and be able to get those hockey shifts, right? Get those guys in and off the field. fresh legs. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But the second thing that comes to mind to me when we talk about that room is just the ability to beat you so many different ways. I mean, shoot, you imagine being one of those tackles out there, left tackle, right tackle, and never mind the fact that you have to stop a guy like Dylan Stewart or a guy like Desmond Umeozulu, whose friggin' length is just good luck trying to hold on to him. Then you got a guy like a little bit more power in there, right? Whether that be like someone like Kennard, but then you have someone like Brian Thomas that comes in on third down or whatever the case may be, depending on the situation, and he's able to beat you in a different way. So, again, it's having that depth, it's having fresh legs, but it's also being able to throw things at this offensive line. Specifically speaking on the outside, you mentioned earlier, Joe, that deep defensive tackle room they have, which, I mean, shoot, add them in there. You're talking about stunts and twists, and we can, talk about a whole different ball game there. But specifically talking about that outside, man, they got the depth, but they also have talent that brings things. Everyone brings something different to the table. It's like Thanksgiving. Everyone's bringing something different. They're not just all bringing turkey.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's a perfect way to put it, Mike, right? And what this does is it gives Clayton White options. Gives him a lot of options, a lot of different options to run. I mean, from the blitz, from the pass rush standpoint, that allows you to be a little bit more free with your linebackers. When you have more options up front, allows you to rotate more in, give different looks. So, I mean, like going into this season, right, from a roster standpoint, Clayton White has dealer's choice, really, in what he wants to do, right? Because he finally has options in his base scheme, kind of players that he obviously likes because he recruited them all. But I think, he should have dealer's choice. And again, knock on wood that everyone stays healthy and everything, because we saw what happened last season, right? You got banged up at the beginning of the year. You were playing linebackers out the wazoo, calling guys up. And so, I think this season, like what this tells me, Mike, and looking at the roster, and basically what we're saying is looking at the roster on paper is it looks pretty good, right? Or at least in terms of these, two rooms. And so it gives Clayton White a lot of options, got to stay healthy at the base of it. But again, I think you have so many options, so much depth that it's going to be survival of the fittest, right? So you can, play the best. And I think by the end of the season, you're really going to have a rotation and different looks that you like, and everyone's going to find a role that they like as well. And so, I think it's really, really, really good for this defense, really good for Clayton White. And again, you just pray to God everyone stays healthy, because when you have this much depth, it just gives you options as a play caller and what you want to run, what you want to look, or what looks you want to give. And, in terms of an offensive line, seeing, what the defense is bringing at you differently. Like, I think when you have that many options, it really keeps you on your toes, quite literally, when you're, pass block, you see Brian Thomas Jr. coming at you, or you can see Dylan Stewart, right? And it's an entirely different pass block. So, again, I think it's going to be super beneficial to have all these options, but you got to stay healthy. You got to stay healthy.
So I see a question from William, and I'm sure some people out there would like to know this too, William. Some people might know. Again, you can follow Gamecock Central's scholarship breakdown counter. I'll keep you updated as far as what's been going on with the guys that are in, the guys that are out. Brian Shoemaker has done a tremendous job with this list. It's gone, I think, all the way back to 2002. But currently, the projection heading into the fall, South Carolina right now is one under that limit. One under right now. So, look, there's been talks about South Carolina attacking the portal for an offensive lineman. I've seen a couple of you talk about that. Let's see. Still looking for an offensive lineman. I think in a perfect world, they'd like to be able to bring in two more. Now, I bring that up right after the fact of mentioning where they are from a number standpoint, because I think back to what Shane Beamer said last week. Now, some of you who are listening to that show, we appreciate it. You'll know where I'm going with this. For those of you that didn't watch, or you may have missed what Shane Beamer said last Monday when he was out in Florence during the Welcome Home Tour, he said something that really stood out to me, because I asked him point blank, I said, how do you continue to attack the portal when you know you're at that 85 scholarship limit already? Now, as I've said many times before, I've made the comparison, and I think I said it actually to Shane, comparing it to the NFL with salary cap. I always say that, the cap is crap, because you can manipulate those numbers to make things work for you from a salary cap standpoint. When you look at it from a college standpoint, obviously it's not salary cap, but the point being is you can still maneuver things, manipulate whatever way you want to phrase it. And one thing that Beamer mentioned, that saying that they haven't done yet, but it's something that you keep in mind. Let's get the exact quote. Quote, with name, image, and likeness, and again, this is coming from Shane Beamer last Monday night in Florence. With name, image, and likeness, there's a different avenue now to get creative if needed. We're really not, but that's something that some schools are from that standpoint. There's conversations that we've had with guys as well. There's the rule that if you've graduated, you can still go into the portal. So there are many situations with that, and we'll see how things transpire. So what's interesting is a couple things. One, mentioning being able to get creative with name, image, and likeness. So, for example, I think we said this last week, Joey Four-Star over here, hell of a football player. You don't have any scholarships left, but you want, Joey Four-Star to come on in and play for your team. Well, what can you do? You can get creative. So let's just use round numbers. Let's not get crazy here and, how much USC costs and this and that. So let's say 50,000, right? Let's say it costs 50,000, right? Board, tuition, all that stuff for a year. But on top of that, you're going to give Joey Four-Star an additional 100,000 to come because of what you'd give him from an NIL standpoint. So altogether, he gets 150,000. That takes care of school. That also takes care of the NIL side of it as well. Again, it all is NIL, but that takes care of school, and then you also give him some additional NIL. So that's one way to do it. Is that right? That's a story for another day. And again, as Beamer mentioned, he said that they haven't done that yet. However, there are schools out there that are. So I've always been a believer of this, Joe. You might not be a fan of that. All right. There could be some fans out there that aren't crazy about doing that. However, if other schools are doing it, are you just going to try to be the moral police? Are you going to try to be a Gandhi? I mean, I know there's some teams out there in college football that don't want to use the transfer portal because they feel like they're Gandhi right now. But the point being, or maybe let me take that back. They've gone into the portal. They just haven't get guys, but their fan base will tell you though, that they're not using the portal. So at some point you have to ask yourself, are we going to try to be the moral police, or are we going to take advantage of what the rule is and the way it's put on paper? And I think that's what you got to do for your South Carolina at some point. But again, there's another thing that he mentioned, talking about grad transfers moving on out. We saw that with Drew moving on out. So could that be the case over the next couple weeks, next couple months heading into fall? It's always a possibility. Would I be shocked if we saw an additional? Nothing surprised me. And I know rules have changed with grad students, but nothing surprises me anymore these days, regardless of deadlines. And just because, just when you feel like you've seen it all, especially over these last 2 years, something else happens. And I think that's just the reality of college sports. Again, regardless of when a grad student needs to declare.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, Mike. I think, you're hitting the nail on the head there too with this kind of predicament, I guess, with the roster spots and the NIL money and all that stuff. It's a weird predicament that we're in. And obviously the way that things have been changing and the way that things are changing, it's not going to be this way for long, right? So this one predicament of, NIL money, scholarship, whatever, it might mean something for the next year or the next 2 years or whatever, however long it takes them to figure out, what the employee-based pay or something like that, which we're clearly and obviously moving towards. So, I think these little, I guess, shadier things or whatever, the NIL money or finding the loophole, if you will, is only really going to exist for another year or so, because again, the NCAA is coming with a complete plan to, pay athletes and stuff like that and do it all legitly through the schools. And then you will also have NIL, because obviously that's not going anywhere. But yeah, no. So I think, Mike, it's just part of the game at this point. Like it really is. It's part of the game that you have to play if you're a head coach. And also like collectives. I mean, it's something that you got to figure out what's best for your program. And, if everyone else is doing it, I mean, I don't know if there's any reason to be the Gandhi, right. To really put a stop to it, because again, and there, it might roll down to, your position, and you might be in this spot, in a certain calendar year, right? So it's interesting to see. It's obviously whenever this kind of stuff comes up with roster spots and whatnot, it's always interesting to see how different programs react to it and handle it and whatnot. So, I think it'll be interesting to see. But again, I think, all of this, kind of gray area will be gone in a couple of years anyways, because they're going to the employee model.
Well, and if it's not gone, it will certainly look different. And I think that's just the reality of the ever changing. When I look at college sports right now, we talk about NIL, we talk about transfer portal. If you go back to, say, 2 years ago, even, what we maybe envisioned what it would look like, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure some of us out there figure that there would be some wild, wild west to it, and certainly it has played out that way in some regards. But where it has got to now, I don't know if we would have figured it would get to this point, at least when we're talking about the nitty gritty of it all and some of the things that play out with it. But, that's just how it goes, right? You got to roll with the punches. And I think not just South Carolina, who certainly has taken advantage of the transfer portal this offseason. I mean, they saw a handful, 2 dozens, more than 2 dozen players leave, but the majority of them on scholarship. But they also were able to bring in over 20 players via the portal. And when we break it down positional group to positional group, from a talent standpoint, from an experience standpoint, from a proven background standpoint, regardless of where they played at, checks off all those boxes. And they certainly have improved and have flipped a lot of their rooms based on how they looked either towards the end of the season or how they were shaping up to be with some of those players entering the portal, right? You look at the running back room in particular. Mario Anderson hits the portal. It's like, all right, well, South Carolina's running back room was already going to be thin. Mario leaves. Now what? Well, what do? They go out into the portal. They bring in 3 talented players that have experience, and they're also bringing in one of the top running backs for the class of 2024 with Matthew Fuller arriving at South Carolina towards the end of this month. You look at the linebacker room and some of the things that were going on in that room. Stone Bland hits the portal. Pup Howard hits the portal. Now what? That room was already thin during the season when you look at it towards the end of 2023. Shoot, now they got to replace those guys. Now they got to go. Look how things have played out in that room. Another position that got flipped. So those are 2 positions that really stand out to me that they've been able to flip. We can say this about a couple positions. But that's kind of where things are at as far as that is concerned. Moving along, JoJo, the other thing that we're looking at, we're talking about the offensive line that South Carolina is going to be holding. Let's see. They'll be hosting Colin Truitt, offensive lineman from Chattanooga, 6'3", 300-pound offensive lineman, is a former freshman All-American and 2-time All-Conference selection. So we mentioned having the ability to go out into the portal to take advantage of some of these numbers that you still have from a scholarship standpoint. They're continuing to do that. And if they're able to take care of that, it'd be phenomenal. I'll read a little bit about what Chris wrote just yesterday.
Yeah.
Chris wrote, the South Carolina staff has an in-person meeting lined up with the former All-Conference selection. Gamecocks will conduct an in-home visit with Truitt on Friday, according to a report from On3's Portal Pete does a great job of covering all the portal stuff. So there you go. Truitt has played in a total of 34 games, named as an All-Southern Conference Player of the Year selection twice. Entered the portal as a grad transfer on April 1st. Tulane has extended an offer to Truitt. The Gamecocks have not as of yet. South Carolina head coach Shane Beamer has previously noted the Gamecocks would look into the portal for some additional depth on the offensive line. So there you go. If you want to read more of it, head on over to Gamecock Central, see the full story from Chris, learn more about Truitt. I like this pickup. I like this pickup South Carolina does offer him. And I think, put it this way, going to his house is a big deal, especially when we're talking about portal players. But you're also trying to learn about these players fairly quickly. So I'm assuming you'll have like a Lonnie Teasley in that room, right? And if Lonnie likes what he sees, if Beamer likes what he's hearing, they'll make the offer probably on the spot, or they'll make the offer later that day or immediately the next day after. Point being is they're not going to wait around for this, especially when they know time is of the essence. I mean, there's going to be there's already players on campus, but there's going to be a good portion, like the majority of the team is going to be here by the end of May, early June. That includes some of the freshmen that weren't here. There was only like the trio of them in the spring. But the point being is you want to take advantage of getting these players in here as quickly as possible. And I think more than anything, when you're talking about the offensive line, you want him to get acclimated as quickly as possible. So don't be surprised to see South Carolina offer Truitt shortly after if they like what they see. And at that point, Truitt's got to make a decision. I mean, shoot, to me, if Tulane is the only real, I mean, I got to go back through, see, the other schools that he's being offered by, but to me, it would make sense. And he'd have an opportunity to come in here and compete. And South Carolina has had some success with being able to bring some FCS talent in here. I mean, look in the line last year. All the bozos out there that didn't think Gargiulo did good things. I mean, he was just drafted by the Broncos, for crying out loud. So, they have been able to find talent, obviously, as we've talked about many times before with the offensive line. It's not just about bringing in talented pieces. It's about being able to find 5 players that can play well next to each other. So that's a totally different conversation, but continue to add good players, especially on the offensive line. I like this one, and hopefully South Carolina can get the job done this week, Joe.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think, this kid, certainly can help the O-line. What I was going to say, Mike, is like, you need offensive linemen, most in particularly on campus as soon as possible, right? You need these guys to mesh. We've talked about it. We've said it before. We've said it again. And I'm going to tell you again one more time because why
Say
not?
It again, JoJo. Say it again.
Yeah. So the offensive linemen, right? These guys need to be tight and knit. If they're not on the same page, you're screwed. Plain and simple. Like, so I think, these guys need to start building, a rapport with each other. They need to start building up, just chemistry. That's really all it is. So if you're going to go out, and especially if you expect to get a guy that you expect to play, which has been Shane Beamer, like the whole staff's, strategy in the portal is, right, you want to go get a guy that you can plug and play in your lineup for the most part. I mean, they've taken guys where it's like, okay, they might be able to help us down the road. But, I mean, realistically, they want each guy that they add in the portal to play for them, like, immediately. So, again, I think this Chattanooga kid, certainly has a lot of potential. If they see that high ceiling, and if Lonnie thinks that they can get it out of him, I think that's great. And, like you said, Mike, they'll offer him really quickly if they think he's the right guy. So, but need to do it. If you think he's the right guy, do it soon, because again, offensive linemen need to get chemistry on board. And I think that's just going to be something big to watch. If you can get him here soon, look out, because again, that chemistry is building up, and by the end of the summer, you want to have like 5 or 6 guys that are tight knit, used to playing with each other, all on the same page, ready to go.
Yeah, good offensive linemen, especially when you're looking for them in the portal. They go like milk and bread during a hurricane. I mean, they go right off the shelves quickly. So the fact that there is one that has had a lot of success at the FCS level, and look, we've seen players come from the FCS ranks to talk about the offensive line, but I mean, goodness, you look out just a couple of years ago with Nate Atkins and the talent that we saw from him. And don't get me wrong, we've talked about this before. Are you going to hit on every single player that you bring in out of the transfer portal, especially players that only have 1 year of eligibility remaining when they bring? Of course not. I mean, it's like finding a good stock, I mean, there could be a stock out there you're trying to hit on and try to, more like a day trade kind of thing, and you're trying to flip it real quick. I mean, there's going to be some things that you're going to hit on. There's going to be some things that you don't hit on. But I do think with some of the players that we've seen from the FCS rank that have come up to this level, or even from Division II schools, right? Patel, Mario Anderson, guys that have made the jump up, they've been able to prove themselves. So again, there's going to be players that, for whatever reason, things don't pick up. And I'm not going to sit here and bash players who've come in here and it just hasn't worked out for one reason or another. You guys know who those players are. But I think for South Carolina, more than anything, having the opportunity to build that depth on the offensive line, that is something that Beamer mentioned in the spring that they needed to do. And at that point, there was, I think he said they wanted to at least bring in one offensive lineman from a scholarship standpoint. Well, what transpired post-spring? Well, there was an offensive lineman that entered the portal, Sidney Fugar, who, oh, by the way, for those of you who care about where Gamecocks go once they leave, Sidney Fugar announced last night that he is headed to Baylor. So he's going to be playing football for the Baylor Bears. But, yeah, I mean, look, I hope it works out because they need an offensive lineman. They need at least one more. I like how that room is already looking. We talked about the additions they've been able to add on that O-line. I mean, someone like Torricelli Simpkins, who has had a lot of success, talking about an FCS player, he's had a lot of success. He was an FCS All-American, for crying out loud. So that's one player that stands out to me. Kamar Bell coming on in, interior offensive lineman. That's another player to pay attention to, another transfer for South Carolina. Aaron Parks coming in from Oklahoma. We talked about this, I think, last week, Joe, that someone like Aaron Parks or Goodwine that came in from Alabama on the defensive line, there's a couple ways to look at this, right? You bring in someone from the FCS ranks who might have a lot of experience. Maybe they're an all-conference selection, and right, that's great. And I've always been big on that. I feel like if you can prove yourself, especially at a high level FCS, you see some of the D2s are more of a chance, taking a chance on some of those guys because you just don't know how they're going to be able to pick things up, especially if they only have 1 year of eligibility remaining. But point being is you bring in guys like this now, looking at it from the opposite side via the transfer portal. Well, a guy like Parks, someone like Goodwine, they don't have the experience, in-game experience. But what they were able to do the last couple of years, they were able to go up against some of the best players in the country because they were playing for some very good teams. They're playing at great programs. Oklahoma, Alabama goes without saying, and they're going up against some of the best each day. So does it surprise me to hear someone like Goodwine's name get mentioned? No. If Parks has a good fall camp and he's putting pressure on players and competing for a spot, which I think right now, I think he's on the outside looking in when we're talking about the starting five. But I'm not going to be shocked to hear some of those guys get into the mix. So specifically talking about the offensive line, I think the beauty of it is already you've been able to bring in some talented players via the portal. We already know the talented players that they've brought in from this 2024 class. Certainly that starts with someone like Josiah Thompson. But how do those things play out, right? A guy like Cam Pringle, a lot of talent, big boy. I think Beamer mentioned it, and I think Cam would be the first one to tell you. And I think, man, you want to talk about this time of the year, May, June, July, before fall camp starts up. You have a lot of these players that are going to be sticking around campus. Cam Pringle is one of those players I would say we need like a before and after photo, because I feel like what will happen is with him, there will be a major transformation with his body in those 3 months. A lot of that baby fat that you see on some offensive linemen that come out of high school. I mean, in his case, he enrolled early, dealt with an injury when he first got here, but you're going to see some of those younger players be able to really develop. And a guy like Cam Pringle, I think more than anything, it would be very beneficial for him to have that redshirt year, be able to understand the system, understand the schematical side of it all, but to also be able to get developed. Because pre-NIL, pre-transfer portal, you talk to a lot of those offensive linemen back in the day. I mean, shoot, I think we've actually had former Gamecock offensive lineman John Strickland on this program, and he's talked about it before, saying that was kind of the mindset when you came out of high school as an offensive lineman. And you could say this for multiple positions, but especially for the O-line, that you wanted to go to college, and as a freshman, you wanted to be able to get developed in the weight room. And having that extra of eligibility, but more importantly, being able to put more of that size on, be able to get a little bit quicker, depending if you're playing that guard position, pulling guard, whatever the case may be, you're able to really elevate your game. So being able to bring in some of these talented players via the portal, whether it be someone from the FCS ranks, whether it be someone playing in now Group 4, Power 4 football, P4, that's going to be so weird to say. But bringing some of these players in that don't have the same resume, but they've gone up against some of the best players in the country, you have a lot already to work with. And if you can bring in an additional player or two via the portal on that offensive line, it's only going to add more competition.
Yeah, most definitely, Mike. Right. I think, the competition aspect is something that they want deep within this program. Something that we hear about it, every single time, anybody jumps on stand for media availability. So competition's the biggest thing, I think, at the offensive line. One comment I really liked was the EXOs here. I would love to add an experience. A line guy of PTSD from last season. I prefer to keep them all in bubble wrap over the summer, though. Yeah, and I hear you. But these guys got to get better, right? So I think it's a little bit of both. You got to walk the line a little bit with the help of the O-line. Because, Mike, we've talked about it on this show, too. These are big boys, right? And so sometimes when these guys are that big, they can tend to be a little bit more fragile as well. So
let's piggyback off that. I mean, one player in particular, I know this fan base would really love to be able to see out there and compete for a starting spot, is Marquis Anderson, a guy who dealt with injuries last season, his back tightened up literally moments before the spring game. Joe, for you, what are your realistic expectations for Marquis Anderson heading into this year?
My expectations for Marquis Anderson, if he can stay healthy, he's a starting offensive lineman. He's like a mainstay in your starting lineup, right? I mean, when he went down, when he was struggling last year, but with the injury bug, he was one of those guys that you expected to make the jump with Tree and Tro. Fully expected him to make it in the starting lineup. This kid is really, really, really good at the position, from what we're hearing, right? Like he should be up there competing. He should be a starting offensive lineman for these guys. He just needs to stay healthy. So my expectation is the roof for him if he can stay healthy. Now, again, like we mentioned, these O-line guys, I mean, it happens, right? So I hope Marquis can get all the rest that he needs, because he's really good at the position, and he could really, 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 really help. But so, I mean, the ceiling is the roof, if you will. Little Michael Jordan quote there. But I mean, for Marquis, the expectations are endless if he could stay healthy. He could be really, really, really good for this program. He's just got to stay healthy. And same goes for Cam Pringle, Josiah Thompson. I know they're newer, right? The true freshmen. And again, knock on wood, nothing has really, bugged those guys yet. But you just got to stay healthy, because we know that these kids can play the position really well. So it's really all about it.
Yeah, and I think the frustrating part, too, with Marquis is, you look at what South Carolina has done from a recruiting standpoint, and you mentioned Trevon Baugh, you mentioned Luedecke and Luedecke. They brought in some really talented players in his class on the offensive line. And in a perfect world, you're able to have these guys develop at the same rate, and they're able to continue to improve from their freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, right on the way up. And they're able to really be that unit that you're able to build your program around. And I say build your program around because certainly, look, it starts with your quarterback. And I know when we talk about Lenore Sellers that he's going to have some growing pains at times because he's a young player. But he's also going to have guys that are going to step up for him. We've talked about it from the wide receiver room, right? There's talent in that room, but what does that look like? Who's going to be the guy, right? When crap hits the fan, who's going to be that guy that's going to be able to create separation? Because when you look at South Carolina over the last couple of years, the good and the bad, there's always been at least one wide receiver that you could have counted on. Last year, that was Xavier Legette. The year before, that was Juice Wells. We can go back, talk about Josh Vann. We can go back and talk about Shi Smith, Brian Edwards, Deebo Samuel. Just continue to go back further and further in time. Who's going to be that guy this year? Who's going to be that guy from in that wide receiver room? That's a question that I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about this summer. But the same can be said about the offensive line. Who's going to be that guy that will step up? Because you have talent in that room. You have talent. And there are going to be questions about the tackle positions. I think that's, to me, where it starts. Does a guy like Big Tree, does he get bumped down? I think naturally over time he will. And we've also heard from Lonnie Teasley, even talking about it heading into spring ball, that there was going to be more cross-training this year than anything else, simply because if they're ever in a situation like they were a year ago, that they have guys that are ready to go and can play multiple positions. I mean, having a guy like Nick Gargiulo last year helped them out in a lot of ways. I know it might not have seemed like that at times when you look at the entire offensive line, but put it this way, if Gargiulo wasn't out, even with the busted hand and busted ankle and everything else that he was dealing with towards the end of the season, it would have been even worse. So you don't have that. You don't have the luxury of having someone like Gargiulo who you could just, take him out here, plug him in this spot. You have guys on that offensive line, like a Torricelli Simpkins, who has the ability to play both guard and center, but we haven't seen it yet at this level. And I think that's the question mark. When I talk about who's going to step up, that's what we're talking about. Vershawn Lee, he's proven that he can play multiple spots on the offensive line. I think he's a guy right now that, outside of Torricelli Simpkins, that I would expect to be the center, at least heading into fall camp. I think Torricelli, and I think you'll also see Lee compete for that starting center spot. But the offensive line, I mean, look, I don't care how talented Lenore Sellers is. I mean, you saw last year with Spencer Rattler, and granted, there's some skill sets that are a little bit different there. There's different things that both players bring to the table, but it doesn't matter how talented Lenoris is. If he's not getting the protection that he needs, never mind the fact of being able to get guys open on the outside and be able to create separation, none of this will matter. None of this will matter. So that's kind of where I stand when we talk about the offensive line and being able to create that depth. It's important. It goes without saying.
Yeah, it really does, Mike. Again, and we'll see how these guys pan out. Because again, a lot of inexperience on that offensive line, but you also do have some experience in Vershawn Lee and those type of guys. So good mix. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out during the summer for sure.
Carolina Titan says Wanamaker is gone, right? He seemed very undersized for the offensive line. Yeah, Tyson Wanamaker, he was removed from our scholarship count on January 19th. That was around the same time when Trey Jones retired. So the way that it was phrased to us, Trey Jones, Wanamaker, both retired from football. retired from football. So that's kind of where we stand with that. Joe, not much more really to add, I feel like, today. And
Not
that's
really.
kind of just the reality of it when you're talking football May 14th. But there'll be plenty of things to talk about over these next couple weeks, because as we get closer to June, I would expect things to pick up. But bear with us. We'll see if any news comes out at the end of this week as the Gamecocks look to add another offensive lineman. But as always, let's hit some ads, Joe.
There you go, Mike. All right, yeah. Our first sponsor of the day is, as always, is our good friend over at Liberty Tax. Tax is an uncertain feeling you get right before doing your taxes, but you don't have to go through it alone. The tax team at Liberty Tax in Irmo, Lexington, and Columbia will walk you through the process, clear up any confusion, and guarantee you'll get the biggest possible refund or your money back. It's tax time. If you're in a hurry for your refund, call on the tax team at Liberty Tax. They're fast, accurate, and guaranteed. On the other hand, if you think you might be owing Uncle Sam, talk to the Liberty Tax team to make sure you're not paying more than you should owe. They'll find every possible deduction for you. Locally owned and operated, staffed by tax professionals from your neighborhood. Open 9 to 9 on weekdays and 9 to 5 on Saturdays with multiple service options. Start through the Liberty Tax mobile app or through the desktop portal. Make an appointment or just walk in. Give a call to upload your tax documents. And when you come in, your return will be ready to review and sign. Give them a call on your screen right now. And for those listening, 803-462-5576. Once again, 803-462-5576 for all of your tax needs this tax season. Mike, I'm dying over here.
Yeah, I know it could sound like you got to go take some Claritin or something.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know why the
crap
pollen's
out of you.
kicking my butt, but I guess the rain makes it worse. Something like that. I don't know. I'm
not a doctor. I'm the last person to ask about that. But what I can help you with, though, if you're looking for a home, I can introduce you to someone. His name is Clint Hammond. He's been a longtime supporter. I'm not just Gamecock Central, but all of these GC Live shows. That's why one of our very own Wes Mitchell, as well as former Gamecock quarterback and captain Perry Orth, and both of them were looking to purchase a home. Who do they call? They call Clint Hammond. He'll help you with finding the lowest rate on the market, which, as many of you know, for the last 2 years, that has not necessarily been easy. You can make that process and anything else you have with questions much easier for you, because he can answer those questions. Give Clint a call, 803-771-6933. One last thing I want to show before we wrap things up today, Joe, because some of you may have had a chance to see it. Others of you might not have. If you're a subscriber to Gamecock Central, then you've been able to see this. And what that was one of our interviews that we had recently with former Gamecock quarterback Jake Bentley. And I'll tell you what, it was neat to catch up with Jake. Jake was in Rock Hill for a youth football camp. And this is the first time, like in 5 years, that he's really talked about Gamecock football. He was just hired to be quarterback coach / co-offensive coordinator. We talked about a lot of things. So if you're not a subscriber to Gamecock Central and want to hear some of the things that Jake said, head on over there. I mean, he was awesome. I mean, he reflected on his time as a Gamecock. He shared why he doesn't really get too caught up with the what ifs. And we also were able to address something that has been kind of a folktale now. What happened with Jake Bentley in the locker room following the North Carolina game? So this is what Jake had to say, and this is how we'll end it today on GC Live Talking Tuesday.
Has had an opportunity to talk to you, at least from the media standpoints. You got hurt. There's all these crazy conspiracies. You got hurt in the game. Can you tell? You didn't kick any lockers. Can you just put this to bed, Jake? 5 years. Can you put this to bed?
Oh man, no, I did not kick a locker.
Did you see any of that stuff?
Did I? The first day at Rock Hill, I had 3 people ask me, "Oh, you kicked a locker?" No, I did not kick a locker. And on a serious note, it's been a little bit frustrating to see that teammates have came out and said that I kicked a locker, which is a little bit whatever,
Yeah.
But like, come on, man, like have a little bit of sense of pride about the locker room. But no, it happened on the Hail Mary. Twisted my foot, tore a ligament. Can't do that kicking a locker.
There we go.
But no, man, it just It was a freak ligament, a freak incident that really allows you to kind of walk, not run, type of thing. But yeah, man, it's funny nowadays. People say it, but it happened on the last play.
There you go, Jake Bentley. It was good to catch up with Jake because Martin mentions it. You know, Bentley doesn't get enough love. When you look at statistically speaking, I mean, he's one of the greatest Gamecock quarterbacks, statistically speaking. I mean, you can't argue that. You can't argue that based on the stats and what he was able to do. And if he doesn't get hurt that season, then we're sitting here today most likely talking about Jake Bentley as the all-time leader in Gamecock history in passing yards, passing touchdowns, total offense, and just offensive total touchdowns. So, I mean, I got to cover the entire Jake Bentley era at South Carolina. It stunk with how it ended for him because there was talent on that team. There was talent. And, you know, Ryan Helinski came on in. And, I mean, shoot, you look at just everything that happened that year. DK having to play a little bit with that Georgia game, which was a phenomenal upset between the Hedges and Athens. But, yeah, I wish things would have been different for Jake, but that's football, unfortunately.
Yeah, that 500-yard game against Clemson was nuts. I can remember watching that back home in Indiana because I was already wanted to come to South Carolina and everything. And I mean, man, you were so close, but 500 yards out of Jake Bentley was craziness. Absolutely, that game was wild in and of itself, with all the points and everything. But man, I mean, Jake Bentley, that game was probably his signature one. But I mean, I'll also remember obviously the game against Tennessee too at home, touchdown pass, Debo one-handed catch in the end zone. I mean, that was a dime, Debo with the hell of a catch. Those teams were fun, man. And so good to hear from Jake Bentley.
They weren't able to put it all together. I mean, I think that's the thing that was frustrating. They just weren't able to put it all together. There'd be times where the defense and, you know, you had some time. I mean, that's the crazy thing. When you look back at the number of players who were drafted during that era, and there's some players that trickled on over into the Beamer era that got drafted, it makes no sense why they weren't better. And I'm not trying. I mean, again, this is the offseason. I don't want to trigger PTSD for some people, but, you know, we've had interviews with Marcus Lattimore in the past, and Marcus talked about it. Marcus just felt like it was very NFL-like with how they ran things, because Marcus worked under Muschamp during a short period of time during that era. And he just felt like the message in that building, it was more of an individual thing. It was more like, all right, you know, guys are pulling in different directions, and they're not all pulling in the same direction. And when you hear that, it's not like it's rocket science. But when you hear that and you think about just the number of players that were drafted, it makes sense. It makes sense. So, you know, it is what it is.
It is what it is.
It is what it is. Well, I think that's how we're going to wrap things up today. Appreciate everyone that tuned in. Fun episode. Talked a lot about what's going on right now with South Carolina's edge room, what's going on with the offensive line. Talked a little about recruiting, as the Gamecocks will look to potentially land an offensive lineman this week. They have not made an offer yet to the Chattanooga offensive lineman, Truitt. We'll wait and see if that changes after their in-home visit later this week. We also heard a little bit from Jake Bentley, reliving his days as a Gamecock. It's crazy to think it's been 5 years this upcoming year, 5 years since Jake last suited up for the Gamecocks. Again, appreciate everyone that tuned in today. If you missed any of our show, head on over to the Gamecock Central YouTube page where you can watch this show in its entirety there for free. Make sure you hit the little icon, little bell icon, get notified every time one of these GC Live shows drop, as well as listening to us on the podcast platform for Gamecock Central. Wherever you listen to your podcast, you'll be able to find Gamecock Central. He's Intern Joe. I'm Mike Yuba. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday and enjoy the rest of your week.